Great. Well, a good day, everyone. It's good to see that we have a very large group today. So we have a number of you to work with on this very important topic, the TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. And we are joined here today with CDP, IFC, and we're hosted by Bursa Malaysia. So I'm going to pass actually directly to the IFC, who's going to give us some opening remarks. Anna, over to you.
Thank you, Tiffany. Good afternoon to everybody. I can't seem to, okay, hang on. Let me just try to share my video. Okay, I think everybody can see me now. Good afternoon, everybody. I just wanted to kickstart the program by welcoming everyone. And thank you to our partners, Bursa Malaysia, our host, the United Nations Sustainable Stock Exchanges Initiative, and the CDP for the invitation and collaboration on this very important TCFD training workshop. My name is Anna Ng. I'm the Senior Country Officer at IFC's Asia and Pacific Regional Hub in Singapore. So IFC is the private sector arm of the World Bank Group. We work with financial institutions, private sector companies, and regulators to address ESG bottlenecks and also to facilitate sustainable investments in the emerging markets. As a development financial institution, the sustainability of our investments is very critical. And with the recently announced World Bank Group Climate Action Plan, our aim is to fully align our financial flows with the goals of the Paris Agreement. So this includes increasing climate finance, improving and expanding climate diagnostics, focusing on climate results and impact, reducing emissions and climate vulnerabilities in key systems, and also supporting a just transition out of coal. Mainly, IFC is focusing on 5 priority areas of our climate business: clean energy, climate smart agribusiness, green buildings, climate smart cities, and also green finance. So today's training is part of our efforts with UNSSE and CDP to strengthen the environment, social governance, and climate disclosure, and to support stock exchanges as they look to upgrade their requirements in those areas. As you know, and this will be also addressed during the training later, the risks of climate change are manifold. There are the economic, financial disruption and business losses resulting from the increased severity and frequency of extreme weather events. And there are also the transition risks of climate change, including business loss including major policy, legal, technology, and market changes as economies and financial sector adjust towards a low carbon world. To mitigate this risk, IFC's performance standards and corporate governance methodology has been our guiding framework for our investments. As a development finance institution, working with our clients to assess, manage, and disclose their specific climate risks is a very critical part of our work every day. Beyond individual companies, supporting stock exchanges is also very important because enhanced disclosure and transparency enables responsible investments. Stock exchanges, ESG, and climate reporting requirements for listed companies will help to build investor trust, attract capital, and grow strong capital markets, all of which are IFC's priorities. I hope that you will enjoy the training today, and I invite you to also check the market and sector-specific guidelines and toolkits that are available online, which will also be introduced as part of this program. I'm sure you will find those helpful irrespective of where you are in your TCFD journey. I will end my remarks now. Thank you again for joining us, and thank you again to our partners. I look forward to a very fruitful discussion today. Thank you, Tiffany.
Thank you so much for being with us, and the IFC for continuing to partner with us on this really great training opportunity for markets. Just to note, we do have the IFC with us. We have a few colleagues with us now, and we have another one joining shortly, Relitza, who will also be with us the entirety of the program. So we really appreciate the investor perspective that you can all add into this, and encourage anyone who has questions throughout about the investor perspective to feel free to ask so that we can answer those as we go. I'm going to dive straight in because we have a huge amount of content to cover today. It's two of us that are training with you today. So myself from the SSC, and then Davide, who you see there as well, will be working with us today too from CDP. And we're going to cover 2 hours with you today. And just to note that this was followed up with another 2 hours next week. So just to note that today we're going to do a short break halfway through. In the first half of this session, we're really looking to set the context, understand what climate-related risks and opportunities are and why it's important to disclose this information, as well as what are the recommendations of the TCFD. We'll give you a short break at 5 o'clock your time, around about halfway through. And then we're going to look at some practical steps. How do you get started on this? How do you start evaluating where your company's at? And we're going to do an exercise together on that. We will do our best to save time at the end for questions, but we really encourage you to ask them as we go in case we don't have enough time to cover your questions at the end. We keep an eye on that Q&A box as well as the chat box, so please feel free to ask questions throughout, and we'll answer them as we go. A few small housekeeping issues. All of you are muted at the time being as a participant. However, if you would like to speak in the Q&A session, you can raise your hand and we'll unmute you then. In the meantime, during the training, please make use of the chat box in the Q&A to communicate with us. Also, you can access these slides. So we will send them at the end of the presentation. Our colleagues at UNCTAD, we have Rita and Ariana with us today, and they're going to help you out with all of that logistical information. So they'll be able to send you the link to the slides at the end, and then also our feedback survey they'll share, and other links as we go, they'll include in that chat box. So keep an eye on that because we'll be sharing a lot of links as we go in there as well. Regarding the recording, because we'll often get a question about this when we record as well. So this session is being recorded, and if you would like to access that recording, the stock exchange will have it. So you can contact education@bursamalaysia.com if you would like to receive this recording. Great. So what are we going to learn today? So this is part of a 3-pronged training program. The first today is a live workshop on getting started with climate-related financial reporting. And then next week, we'll dig a bit deeper on how to build experience in climate-related financial reporting. And then we'll leave you with additional resources so you can continue your training at a self-paced, self-guided form. So in the 101 session, what we're really looking to cover with all of you is to explain really what financial risks and opportunities are associated with climate change, and the importance of disclosing these risks and opportunities and how your organization is confronting them. Also, we hope to help you understand the key elements of climate-related financial disclosures and outline some characteristics of best practice based on what the TCFD recommends. And then to start the process of identifying how you get started. And we'll continue that in 102 as well. So we'll give you many resources during this training, and this is one of them that we mention often. The model guidance on climate disclosure was developed for stock exchanges to help them to guide their market on this topic. But the second section of it, starting with chapter 1 of the template, is very useful for you as companies as well, because it was designed to copy and paste so that stock exchanges can provide this guidance directly to listed companies. So we'll be referring to certain sections in this report, and in the 101 session, we're really looking at chapters 1 and 2, where we're really setting the stage on climate disclosure and discussing what are these risks and opportunities that we'll need to be considering. When we go into the 102 session next week, we'll be looking more at the content of your disclosure and how it could be presented and validated. So just to get started, we'd like to know a little bit about all of you so that we can tailor our training to your needs as best as possible. So I'm just going to launch a poll here. And we'd just like to know where you consider yourself at right now pertaining to the TCFD recommendations and climate-related financial disclosures. So would you consider yourself already an expert? Do you know a lot about climate reporting already? Maybe you're a consultant and you help others with this. So far, no one has said that option. Are you confident but need a better understanding of some elements? Or do you have some knowledge and need further support? Or do you have little to no prior knowledge? Now, if you did select, I have some knowledge but need support, feel free to drop in the chat what you need support with, and we'll keep an eye on that and make sure we can speak to that directly. So I'm going to leave that open for a little bit so everyone has a chance to let us know where they're at. And Davide, maybe I'll pass to you because you'll be taking us through the next session.
Sure. Thank you, Tiffany, and thank you everyone for attending and for showing your interest in this topic, which is very much at the center of attention, has been very much at the center of attention for the last few years, I would say, and growing. And we have seen, even just from last week, from this week, actually, the latest IPCC report showed the urgency of climate action. And so this could not be timed better, this event. It is nice to see that some people have some knowledge. There are a few who are confident, and we will expect some questions from you. Do not worry, we'll do our best to answer them. And even for those that have little or no prior knowledge, we hope to allow you to get out of this session and the next session being able to be at a higher level and being able to start implementing and understanding what this is all about, because we understand that it can be quite challenging and quite worrying up to a certain extent, but it is not about reinventing the wheel. As we will see, lots of the things that we will be saying you already have, and so it will be just about using the tools that you have in a better way. First of all, though, we want to just set the stage and give the idea of what we're talking about and what climate change is, and why we should take action against climate change and against its risks and seizing the opportunities. So it is by now unequivocal that human influence has warmed the atmosphere, the ocean and land, that widespread and rapid changes in the atmosphere, in the ocean, in the cryosphere have occurred, and that global surface temperature will continue to increase until at least mid-century under all the emission scenarios that have been considered. Unless deep reductions in carbon dioxide emissions and other greenhouse gas emissions occur in the coming decades, global warming will happen over 1.5 degrees, global warming of over 2.5 degrees, and over will happen. So something must be done. Now, the latest IPCC reports, the one that we have shown here, which is from August, and the one from the last few days, and yes, we will link the latest report later in the chat, show that while impacts from climate change are unavoidable now, the risks can be massively reduced under lower warming scenarios. There is no safe level of warming, but limiting emissions will limit the risks, and taking early action will help limiting these risks. However, as we said, we are already seeing that there are effects at societal level, at business level. We have seen droughts, we have seen floods, wildfires, extreme weather events, typhoons in Southeast Asia. So the effects of climate change are already here, and it is the time to start thinking about what to do. Why? Because the risk is here, and the World Economic Forum has shown for the last few years as a top risk for the last 5 years that that environmental risks are at the top of the global risk by likelihood. For over the next 10 years, the latest report has shown that there is an expectation that these risks will remain high, if not actually at the top of the scale over the next 10 years. And this will have significant and lasting impacts on our economic growth and the prosperity in our societies. And the realization that there is a connection between climate change and environmental risks and financial stability is what led to the creation of the TCFD. You may have heard about Mark Carney's Tragedy of the Horizons speech, where Mark Carney showed and highlighted the fact that our time frames for monetary policy and to assess the stability of the financial system are not long enough. We do not have, or at least we didn't have, the tools necessary to understand the long-term risks of climate change. So this led to the creation of the TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, in order to be able to understand these risks better and to better take action against these risks. What are these risks for businesses, especially? Because we are here talking about the financial impacts and financial opportunities as well, and we will see of climate change on business. Well, climate change and climate-related risks can have impacts on the assets that a business has, such as its production facilities, such as offices, on the demand of services and products. There can be increased costs or reduced demand for products and services. There may be fines and penalties linked to increased regulation, and we're already seeing a growth in regulation around climate change, a growth in regulation on climate disclosures. So this is an actual risk that is growing. And last but not least, changes in investment, with investors looking for different investments that are not so exposed to climate change, or that investors that want to invest in different businesses that are more ready to respond to the different requirements of the public for public and services that are more green. And this neatly links us to the opportunities of addressing climate change. Addressing climate change can support growth and innovation by developing products and services that contribute to climate mitigation. It can help with lower costs to improve energy and reduce efficiency. It can help increase the reputation of the company with its employees, with customers, with other stakeholders and society as a whole. And also, and this word you will hear quite often throughout these training sessions, it can help improve resilience of the business to business disruptions. We want to highlight here that the opportunities of taking climate actions far outweigh the risks and the costs, most of all, the costs of taking this action. In 2019, CDP ran a research and published a report showing that there are $970 billion in potential risks from climate change to the global economy, but also $2.1 trillion in potential opportunities. As you can see, the opportunities are more than double the risks and more than double the costs of taking climate action. So if there is one thing that we want to want you to get from these sessions is that it's not only a matter of risk, and you will see how we and the TCFD support this idea that climate change action, climate action needs to be included throughout the company's operations, because it affects also its strategy. It affects a lot more than the simple risks. Moving on, how do we want to address these risks? And how do we want to assess materiality of climate risks and opportunities? There are two ways of doing this. One way is what is called single materiality, which is the one that TCFD adopts, which focuses on the risks and the impacts on the company from climate change and the opportunities as well. The other vision, the other way in which this can be assessed is what is called double materiality, in which alongside the risks and impacts on the company, there is this idea of assessing what impacts the company has on people and planet. Now, this second view is the one that also allows a company to assess how much it is supporting the goals of the climate agreement, of the Paris Climate Agreement, or the UN 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. So it is a wider vision. For the TCFD, the focus is on risks and opportunities, because we're talking about financial stabilities, we're talking about companies and their the effects of climate change on companies. And so we will be talking about these more than anything. We'll be talking about the risk aspect of it. Moving on. How do investors use climate-related financial disclosures? So why should you focus on these? Well, what would be the interest for you? Well, on the one side, for investors, it is important to be able to mobilize private sector finance to deliver upon the Paris Agreement. Investors will be able to use climate-related risks and price climate-related risks into their company valuations. And these analysis of climate risks supports a more efficient allocation of capital towards businesses that are low carbon and are resilient in the long term, more resilient. This all, again, doesn't necessarily mean reinventing the wheel. It is a matter of using established approaches that support investment decisions. So to recap, what are the benefits of climate-related financial disclosures for companies? Well, there are internal and external benefits. On the internal side, there are cost savings by identifying opportunities for resource, for energy efficiency. There is an improved strategic resilience. Here we go again, talking about resilience. There is the identification of potential opportunities related to climate change. There is an improved robustness of the risk management processes. And also there is and you will see what we mean, especially in the second section, where we talk about the disclosures on governance for board and management. There is an improved communication between the board and the management on climate issues. It helps create these channels of communication. On the external side, well, reporting on climate change, reporting on climate issues supports an improved access to capital, because as we have seen, investors do care and are starting to care more and more about it. Provides improved engagement with investors, supports the preparedness, the company's readiness to upcoming climate regulation, supports the company's reputation with customers, with employees, and with the wider stakeholders and with the society at large, and helps the companies that move first to establish a leadership position, to be able to position themselves as a company that has moved and that is moving, that is ahead of the curve, and then reap the benefits for it. Moving on, we have at this point a poll for you, asking which of the following are examples of climate-related financial risks. Is it reduced demands for products and services? Is it increased costs due to extreme weather damage? Is it lower costs due to reducing energy consumption? Or is it higher rates of taxation due to possible carbon pricing? I see that we do not have any questions yet. That is good for now.
We don't yet, but please feel free, everyone. If you have any questions, don't worry, that's not saved in the recording. So you can anonymously give your questions if you wish.
And thank you to Ariana for linking the climate change report, the latest climate change report, which makes for interesting read. Maybe not the happiest at the moment, but
okay, we have a really big crowd today, so I might close the poll in just a few seconds here. So not everyone will get a chance to answer, but at least we've got above half that have answered now.
Yeah.
There you go, Davide.
Thank you. And I see that we have been relatively clear. With regards to financial risks, yes, reduced demand for products and services is definitely a risk. Increased costs due to extreme weather damage is a risk, and higher rates of taxation due to possible upcoming carbon pricing, yes. With regards to lower costs due to reducing energy consumption, this is not a risk in this case, but it is an opportunity from climate change. So it is something that should be taken into account, but not as a risk. Moving on to the global and local reporting landscape. As we have seen, there is a growth in climate disclosures, in environmental and ESG disclosures more large. Here we're focusing on that. And there is a number of frameworks and standards that are already being used around the world. And here we want to ask you, which frameworks and standards do you currently use? Is it CDP? Is it ISSB? Is it GRI? Is it the integrated reporting? Is it CDSB? Others, which we are interested to hear about, what those might be, or whether you don't currently use any yet, potentially.
Davide, since we have such a big crowd today, I might give them a little bit more time and maybe ask a question of you that we often get asked at this point. So one of the common questions you're very familiar with now is, why is TCFD not on this list? Do you want to maybe delve into that a little bit with everyone while they're answering?
Absolutely. Well, TCFD is not on this list because in a way TCFD is everywhere on this list. All of these frameworks or standards have taken TCFD into consideration, and you can say that by reporting to these standards, I may have a vested interest, but I can say certainly for CDP, our climate change standard has been aligned with CDP since 2019, with TCFD since 2019. So you can say that reporting to CDP or one of these other standards will allow you to report in compliance with TCFD, the TCFD recommendations.
Great, I'll share the results here of the poll now.
Okay, good to see GRI, as often happens, is quite widespread, and that makes perfect sense. But it's good to see that also CDP, SASB, the integrated reporting, and CPSB have some followers.
I'm intrigued by the other. We have 33% that use other frameworks. So I'd encourage everyone to type in the chat box what they might be using, so we have a better idea of that.
Absolutely. Okay, now you will have heard, now you have heard now, and you will have probably heard already, these what people call alphabet soup of disclosures. There are a number of sustainability reporting organizations, frameworks, standards that, realizing that the market was fragmented and there was uncertainty around this disclosure world, came together in 2020 and decided to issue a statement of intent to work together towards supporting and developing environmental and climate disclosures. They put out a prototype climate-related financial disclosure standard in 2021, adopting this view that all the standards and the frameworks have a central goal at heart, but they can be used and can be integrated and work together in different ways, with some with a focus on value creation, some with a wider focus on impacts on people and planet. And this is leading to the developments and supporting the developments also at a regulator level. We are seeing a growth in the number of countries that are mandating climate disclosure, taking and realizing that climate disclosure was born as a voluntary element. TCFD was born as a voluntary disclosure framework. All the others that we have seen are voluntary, but the governments around the world are coming to the conclusion that adopting a mandatory approach is necessary and is desirable to ensure the uptake of climate risk disclosure at pace and at the scale needed to safeguard the markets from climate-related risks. We are seeing a strong movement. Well, we have seen a movement in Europe. We are seeing a strong movement in Southeast Asia as well, and we will see in a moment what the developments have been in Malaysia. But all around the world, there is a movement. Now, all of this has led to the creation of the ISSB, the International Sustainability Standards Board, within the IFRS, which, if any of you is an accountant, you will have heard about, you probably have heard about anyway, living in the business world. And the COP26, the announcement of the creation of the ISSB was welcomed by 40 jurisdictions, and we are now seeing some jurisdictions, especially in Latin America, starting to announce that they will implement the ISSB standards in their securities law. So this is gaining ground. So what is the focus of this of the ISSB and its upcoming standards? The focus is similar to that of TCFD, and we will see that the proposed standards are based on the TCFD recommendations. So with a focus on enterprise value, with focus on risks and opportunities for business, so what we mentioned as single materiality earlier. The goal is to create a global baseline upon which further disclosures can be built as well. The scope is wide is sustainability at large, but starting on working on climate. And the idea is to build on existing frameworks, such as, for example, the CDSB, such as the Value Reporting Foundation, to not reinvent the wheel, as it is not necessary. As we have mentioned, the IFRS, the ISSB standards will be based on the TCFD recommendations and the TCFD pillars, if you want to call them like that, of governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. And again, first will be a climate, then there will be an expansion on 2 other environmental issues. Moving on, in Malaysia, what have been the latest developments? Bank Negara Malaysia has supported proposal for mandatory TCFD aligned disclosure for financial institutions by 2024. There is currently a consultation for a reference guide on climate risk management and scenario analysis for financial institutions. There will be developments of further guidelines and material. We have seen the Malaysian Code of Corporate Governance updated to include new guidance on sustainability governance, and Bursa Malaysia's sustainability reporting guide now strongly encourages listed issuers to address the TCFD recommendations in their annual report. And our colleagues at IFC, if you have any doubts, please contact them or contact me, and I will be able to put you in contact with our colleagues in the country to support you and help you. Going on, we can move to the actual TCFD recommendations, and Tiffany will take you through them. So Tiffany, the floor is yours.
Great, thanks. I was just sending a link to a document to Ariana, and then she's going to share it in our chat there. Sorry, 2 seconds here. There we go. Ariana, if you can share that link with everyone. We had a question about GRI. So I just sent via Skype, Ariana, a little link that you can share with everyone that maps both GRI and SASB to the TCFD recommendations. But I just wanted to address that before we move forward, because I think it's really important. The question was in our Q&A, and it's saying that, most people use GRI, so how does it link with TCFD? And I think the important thing to note is that TCFD is really looking at what is the content we need to include in our reporting, and it's looking at kind of the behind the scenes stuff, which I think we'll go into really clearly right now. But then it's not particularly prescriptive of how you present that to your audience. So you can use GRI, or you can use CDP, or you can use CDSB as the framework you're using to present this information. What it is prescriptive about, and I think that's kind of clear in this slide as we get started, is that this is how to get this information to your mainstream financial filing. Whereas a lot of these other frameworks we're looking at is how to create a sustainability report, kind of a standalone separate report that goes along with your financial statements, but is not integrated in your financial reporting. Whereas TCFD is really helping you to identify what climate related opportunities as well as risks are material to your organization. So they have a financial impact on your organization now or in the future. And how does that then appear in your financial filings? So this is what TCFD is trying to help you do, which you can use alongside with those other frameworks. But the good news is it's not meant to add reporting burden on you. You're not meant to have more reporting, but rather to be more effective in your current reporting. So as Davide mentioned, the TCFD recommendations were developed to help identify the information that's needed by investors and lenders and insurance underwriters in order to appropriately assess and price climate-related risks and opportunities. And that's why we're wanting to see it in our financial reports, is because it's used to make financial decisions. They were developed first and foremost to be voluntary. And as they're meant to be voluntary, that means they weren't prescriptive exactly how you necessarily have to put this in, because they're meant to be used in the various jurisdictions and regulations around the world. Now, that said, as Davide just mentioned, increasingly governments are making this mandatory, and they will then go into further detail about the prescription of how you need to include this and what information in particular you need to include. But you can see the TCFD recommendations more as a guidance for your company and for yourselves to understand these risks and opportunities that your organization is facing, and ensure that you have the correct processes in place within your organization to adapt or mitigate these risks and opportunities. Moving down this list here, the recommendations are to help you report climate-related financial disclosures in your annual financial filings. We will go into this a little bit more later to note that sometimes it's easier for companies to start outside of their financial filings and then move things in. So that's an okay first step, but your end objective where you're trying to reach is to integrate this into your financial filings. They were initially developed for the financial sector and high-risk non-financial sectors. So additional guidance is given for those sectors, but the main guidance is used for all sectors. They evaluate two types of risks: transition risks and physical risks, and then also address, as Davide mentioned, the plethora of opportunities that come along with this. So those transition risks are that movement towards a carbon-free economy. So as governments are making these commitments to go net zero, to move towards a more carbon neutral economy, that means a lot of changes around the regulation, changes around political will, changes around your clients' demands, also your value chains demands. So as those changes happen, how does your organization adjust to those changes? But then, of course, there's also the physical risks. So that's, weather changes, flooding, more severe weather that might impact physically your assets. So in order to help you through this, we take more of a forward-looking stance. So previously in our financial filings, we will have taken mostly a backwards-looking stance. We look back at how we've been doing and use that to project how we might do in the future. But they've introduced through the TCFD a tool called a scenario analysis, where it helps you to look at these various future paths that could happen, and what changes would result in your environment, and how you as an organization adapt your strategy to those changes. So we're not looking so much backwards, we're looking forwards. And to do that, we're looking short term, we're looking medium term, and we're looking long term. So while, again, the TCFD doesn't prescribe what is short term, medium term, and long term, because that will differ based on your organization, it's important that you identify that. What would you consider to be short, medium, and long term? And how are you strategizing at these different levels? And then I think what's important to note that we tend to think quantitatively when we think of our financial filings, our P&L, our balance sheet. We're always looking at monetary values here. It's not to say that we don't have quantitative aspects here, and we certainly do. And increasingly, we have more and more science that helps us to quantify this information. But the qualitative aspect is very important as well, specifically as we start in things like our governance and our risk management. These are processes that your organization has to have in place to prepare for these changes, these transition risks, as well as these physical risks. So that requires a discussion with your stakeholders, and that's much more qualitative. So that onion diagram you see on your screen, the outer layer is the governance, and then we move into strategy, risk management, metrics, and targets. We're going to discuss these 4 pillars today, but I don't want you to see them as separate separate pillars per se, but rather integrated together. They're all part of one holistic picture. We just break them down as the TCFD does in order to discuss them each in their own. So as mentioned, there are kind of those 8 kind of additional guidance. So if you land in any of these sectors, either in those financial groupings or in the non-financial high-risk sectors, the TCFD has provided additional guidance. But if you don't fall within one of these high-risk sectors, then you can use the general TCFD recommendations. So it's just to note that if you don't fall in one of these 8 sectors, it's not to say, oh, job done, we don't have to do anything. You'll be indeed in the value chain of many of these high-risk sectors. And it's important that you as well make adjustments in your strategy to the changes coming because of climate change. So the TCFD is helpful for all organizations, not just the high-risk ones. So one of the key points of TCFD is, as we've discussed, where this information shows up. So we've been talking a little bit about whether or not this should appear in a separate report, for example, in your GRI report or in your CDP questionnaire, and how then to get that into your financial filings. We'll discuss a little bit more in 102 how to pull that information into your financial filings. But it's important to note that that's the end objective. While you might not be at that stage today or even in the next year or two, the objective is to make that connection between finance and the climate related risks and opportunities. So the intention is not for a separate TCFD report or statement. However, sometimes that is the starting point, and you know, investors understand that, and we understand that, and we'll talk you through how to get started to make sure that this does eventually get into your financial filings. So this addresses one of the questions as well in the chat, asking to what extent the disclosures are to be validated by auditors. Now, when you get that information into your financial filings, it will undergo the same rigorous validation that your financial information undergoes. So it'll be audited by the same auditors that are auditing your report now. So it's not necessary to have kind of a separate audit. However, when it appears in a separate report, that's a different story. If you have it in your sustainability report and outside of your financial filings, then validating it in a different way may happen. But it's very important that this climate information is subject to the same governance processes and sign off as your mainstream financial filings, because it deals with risks and financial impact in the same way as other areas. Another reason to include it in your financial report is that that's what makes it accessible to investors as the primary users of this information. We discussed a couple slides earlier that the financial sector are using this information to assess and price your organization. So they need to have access to this information. So that's the easiest way to get it in there. I see, Davide, you're busy typing all these answers. Did you need to address anything verbally, or are you okay typing everything?
There are a couple of questions that could be interesting to discuss with you.
Sure.
For example, one that has just come to, and that we do get quite often, is to what extent the disclosures are to be validated by auditors. And links to a question about how auditors are ready at the moment, whether they are ready to actually support. So what would you say?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of data recently that's coming out that is science-based, that's helping us understand a little bit more of these risks and opportunities and how they financially impact our organization. And that's really why the TCFD was developed. And you know, the first recommendations that came out in 2017 have now been used quite broadly. So I think auditors understand how to audit this information the same way they would audit other information, because we're not asking them to look we're not asking them to predict the future. And I think we'll discuss that in the scenario analysis a lot, but rather assessing whether or not your organization is prepared for changes that might come. So I wouldn't say they're unprepared. I'd say we're all increasing our knowledge day by day as the science improves and as we move forward. But I think as we go through the 4 pillars, it'll become clear that the things we're asking organizations to do are not new activities necessarily. So I think they align in normal business activity.
Mm-hmm.
What would you think? Would you have anything to add?
One thing that I would add, and I added in the response, is that they are, well, to echo what you just said, they are taking steps. Auditors are moving. For example, I have a blank about the name because there are so many at the moment, but the Alliance for Financial Service Providers for Net Zero was created just before COP. With a focus on these and including certainly the Big Four and other audit firms. So there is a movement, and they are taking action, also because they are being asked more and more to review financial reports with climate-related focus. So definitely there is movement in this field.
Great. And let's keep that in mind as we go through the 4 pillars, because I think that's very important. And I think it will become a little bit more clear. I'm going to move quite quickly through this slide, but just to note, any of you that are familiar with accounting principles, whether it's the GAAP or IFRS principles that you use for your financial reporting, you'll recognize these principles as well from the TCFD. So just to note that we're not trying to change accounting in any way, but rather we're fitting this information into kind of our existing accounting principles. So being relevant, specific, balanced, understandable, consistent, etc. So I'll quickly move forward here, and just in the interest of time, just give you a moment to answer this question before we launch into the 4 pillars. So just to see who's awake and still with us, true or false, the TCFD recommended that disclosures should be made with a standalone climate risk report. Now, it seems overwhelmingly everybody has been paying attention. So I'll leave that open. You can keep answering. However, the majority of you right now, it's at 90% are correct. So well done, everyone who's been paying attention. Just to note, of course, this isn't prescriptive, is in you have to, from day one, move forward and have all this information in your financial filings. We will go through, today Davide is going to take you through a 3-phased approach of how to start integrating this information. And just to note that the TCFD recognizes that this can take between 3 and 5 years. So it's not something that's going to change automatically in your first reporting cycle as you start to align with the TCFD recommendations, but you can start integrating a little bit at a time. So I'm going to share the results here and congratulate you all. Indeed, the objective isn't to disclose this in a standalone climate risk report. That said, if you need to start that way, that's sometimes a way that companies start, just to kind of do a gap analysis and determine kind of what they have started so far. But we'll go through a process of starting this with you later today. So what are the recommendations of the TCFD? So the first, and this is the outer circle in that onion diagram we were showing you, is looking at governance. And so when we talk about governance, we're really looking at 2 key areas of governance. One is the board, and then the other is senior management. And the senior management, you define as an organization what you want to include in your senior management, but it's really just looking at how does your board and how do your managers assess and manage climate risks and opportunities in your organization? So this is things like, maybe do you have a committee that's dedicated to looking at either sustainability more broadly or climate specifically? What processes do you use? How often do these people meet? How are you updating the knowledge at your board level and education? So this is really mostly a qualitative exercise of starting that conversation with your investors and your stakeholders about how, as an organization, you're staying on top of this information organization, and making sure that you don't have, huge blind spots in your risk management processes, and making sure that you're governing these risks and opportunities in an appropriate way. Now, by doing this, it really ensures that addressing these risks and opportunities become a business as usual, and it drives continuous improvement within your organization. Now, just to note, we're going to go deeper into these next session, and we're going to provide examples of what this looks like. But for now, we just want to introduce what it means and what levels of the organization you should be integrating this into. So then if we moved further into the onion diagram, we get to strategy. And in the strategy component, we're really looking at three key areas. In A, what we're looking at is the material risks and opportunities that your organization has identified over the short, medium, and long term. And that material aspect is quite important here. So in the strategy component, and this is the same for the metrics and targets component, we put a lens, a financial materiality lens here. So what the TCFD is recommending you include in terms of your strategy as an organization is how you're responding to those risks and opportunities you've determined to have a financial impact on your organization. So identifying what risks and opportunities you have identified and how you identified those, but then also how you identified that impact, that financial impact, and what is that financial impact that you're expecting from those transition risks, physical risks, and opportunities. And then finally, the resilience, how you're going to be resilient against these risks and opportunities. And in that box C, the resilience is really making use of that tool we discussed, that scenario analysis, which is helping you to look at various pathways in the future and identifying how your strategy withholds in that new future. Now, again, we'll dig much deeper into this next week. But just to know that this is a tool you can use, and the objective is looking into the future and playing out these scenarios and identifying how resilient you are as an organization. Now, the TCFD updated recently the strategy components and the recommendations. However, just to note that these recommendations are really just additional guidance that you can use. So in the first component of strategy, where we're looking at the identification of risks and opportunities, there's additional guidance now for banks on looking at how they can identify their exposure to carbon-related assets. And in the component B, they were looking more at, and C, more explicitly looking at financial impacts and the transition plan of disclosures. So you can, in the 2021 updated version of the recommendations, you can find additional guidance in the strategy component. Then if we move further into the onion diagram, the third area that the TCFD provides guidance on and recommends you provide information on to your investors is risk management. Now, unlike the strategy component, in risk management, there's no financial materiality lens, because in this area, what we're looking is at process. We want to understand how you as an organization, what processes you use to identify risks and opportunities. So in the first box in risk management A, you're expected to describe the organization's processes for identifying and assessing your climate-related risks. And then in B, risk management B, you're asked to describe the organization's processes for managing those climate-related risks. And then finally in C, it's how you're integrating this process of managing climate-related risks into your holistic risk management process. So here you want to identify things like how you determine relevance of risks. And often you'll see in a report kind of a heat map where, on the x-axis, they'll have something like impact on stakeholder groups. On the y-axis, something like impact to organizations' finances. those vary between each company, how you decide those sides, and then you kind of map all of the potential risks and opportunities. So some of them will be determined not that relevant to your organization, and some of them will be highly relevant, which is then, you know, those ones that you move into the strategy sector. So this is really looking at that holistic process you use. And then finally, the fourth element of the TCFD recommendations is your metrics and targets. And again, this applies that financial materiality lens. And so that's important to note here, because often companies will include metrics only because they see other people doing it, but they're not linking it to their strategy. So they might be providing information on their emissions, for example, which is very important to do. However, they're not then linking those emissions to their strategy. For example, you might not have used your emissions metrics to identify where the hotspots in your value chain are, or the biggest risks are to your organization, and then ensure that your strategy is able to be resilient to changes that might happen in that value chain. So that might mean, you know, you might depend highly in a particular sector that's going to go through some pretty drastic changes in the future. So how are you going to adapt to those changes, for example? So metrics and targets can be very important to help you along that process of changing your strategy and ensuring resilience. So in this category, what you're looking to include is, of course, what metrics you're using and how you determined those were appropriate metrics to use. And then, of course, always including your emissions, not only because your value chain requires this and investors require this, but for your own evaluation of kind of key risks in your value chain and key risks in your organization. It's important to identify where the high emissions are in your processes. And then finally, the targets that you're setting. And just to note, there's been, again, updates here in the metrics and targets area. And so that's really put an emphasis on scope 3 emissions. So moving towards everyone disclosing their scope 3 emissions. And that's encouraged to be through the GHG protocol framework. And then also adding interim targets. When we're talking about targets with climate, you'll probably be hearing things like net zero by 2050 or net zero by 2045. That can be really far away. So making sure we're setting an interim targets to make sure we're meeting those goals. And then additional metrics have been added in the recommendations for financial activities in the financial sector. So I know that was a real quick whistle-stop tour of these 4 pillars, but as you can see here, they're all very much interconnected, and they all have to do with how your organization is integrating climate-related information into how it operates and how it creates its strategy and its risk management processes, and making sure that it's governed appropriately. So I'm going to hold on that slide for 2 seconds, because I see that there's a few comments here that might be relevant. So Eric mentions that unfortunately many companies are not in a position to say we have considered climate change in our strategy, and TCFD recommends just make this crystal clear. So I'm not sure if I fully understand this question. So maybe Davide, if you do, please feel free to. Do you understand it, or should I?
Is it the latest question that you're referring to, the one about?
Companies are not in a position to say we have considered climate change.
I would say that yes, companies are at the moment in many places around the world. Companies are not. They are not yet ready, maybe, to say that they fully comprehend climate change. They fully comprehend the risk of climate change for their strategy, and they fully consider climate change in their strategies. And this is, in good measure, what we will be trying to do over these 2 courses, showing you also through examples and case studies how you can start implementing these. Now, we do understand that it is not the easiest thing, and it is not a quick thing. As Stephanie said, it might take between 3 and 5 years to implement the TCFD recommendations. The main point is to get started, And once you get started, you create a gap analysis, and we will see in a moment after the break how this can be done, how creating a gap, first having a gap analysis, then creating a roadmap, creating an internal team, how all this can support you in understanding what you already have in place, what systems you already have in place to disclose climate change or climate-related issues. And this in part answers the following question about the fact that companies are already, some companies are already disclosing, take for example GHG emissions in their sustainability reports. So you may understand, you may realize that you already have in place certain procedures, certain mechanisms that can help you. And also understanding where you want to go and how to assess the materiality of these issues. So yes, many companies at these very moments do not have a strategy that is aligned with a response to climate change, but it is possible to start, and you will notice that you already have many mechanisms in place that can help you do that.
I think COVID is a great example of that, because if you look at a number of financial filings in the last year or two, you'll notice that they'll address COVID-19 and how they overcame these challenges, or what they did to deal with the financial impact of the pandemic. Similar things are done with climate change. So this is a risk that's facing all of us globally, holistically. And in the same way that you can integrate into your financial filings information about how strategically as an organization you're dealing with the changes of COVID-19 and a pandemic, you can do a very similar thing with climate change. It's the same kind of risk perspective or opportunity perspective. Many companies saw a lot of opportunities in COVID-19 as well, in how they changed their business strategy completely, whether they went entirely online or they adjusted their model to fit kind of the new way we were operating in society. These same decisions have to be made now about the changes we're going to see with climate change. But luckily, you have a little bit more preparation with climate change than we did for sure with the pandemic. And I noticed someone said, how real is it that companies report on scope 3 emissions? Very real, actually. A number of companies are doing it. However, it is a learning process indeed. I think it really takes kind of a consistent increase holistically, because we depend a lot on our value chain also sharing information to be able to develop those scope 3 emissions. So sometimes they can be based on pretty big estimates, but it's important to start that estimate. Maybe you're not going to have the exact level of scope 3 emissions, but what I mentioned before with the hotspots, it can be really helpful for you to identify where the highest condensed emissions are and where you have to be prepared in your value chain. Maybe a supplier, maybe someone you're supplying, if they have very high emissions and are going to have to change drastically their business plan, you will have to be able to react to that.
I'll just jump on this since we're here just to respond to a couple more questions, and then we can move on because we are a little bit late. So the question from Eugene that was about whether the ISSB targets will be, ISSB standard will be based on the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board standards. SASB is part of the Value Reporting Foundation, which is part of the ISSB. So yes, the SASB standards will be taken into account and taken into considerations in the development of the new ISSB reporting standards. At the same time, they will not be the only ones that are taken into account. The ISSB has run a series of consultations, a series of discussions with other actors in the market. So these new standards that will come up later in the year for consultation will be based on, yes, a focus on value reporting. These SASB standards will play a big part, but they will not be the only ones. Second one, quickly, if we can refer to some examples of annual reports that are disclosing climate-related impacts. We will be using quite a few case studies in the second session, and we will link you to the TCFD hub, which allows you to do research specifically from based on geographies.
Great, thanks, Davide. Just to note on this slide, you have all the updated reports and guidance documents you can get directly from TCFD. But yes, as mentioned, the TCFD hub is a great resource to not only get these publications directly from the TCFD, but also see what your peers are doing, seeing what other organizations are doing, and how that links into their financial filings. So you can search that hub specifically for the type of report you're looking for. So if that's the mainstream financial report and how that's being integrated, you can look for those specifically. And that database just keeps getting bigger and bigger. So just before we go to break, I'm going to whiz through this slide as well, but you'll receive these slides if you want to take a look, just to note that progress is happening, and globally, a number of organizations are now publicly committing to the TCFD. And someone said, you know, our companies aren't at the stage right now where they can necessarily integrate into their strategy. Well, the first stage is just saying you're starting. So showing your public support for the TCFD, having a conversation with investors to say, okay, we get it, climate change impacts all of us. We're going to start looking into it. We're going to start aligning our reporting with the TCFD. And that starts with internal changes. So give us time, we're working on it. And then setting forth a roadmap and moving forward, which we'll discuss. So in your region, there's already a lot of great disclosure to look at, really great increases recently. So you have a lot of examples to follow as well, even in your region. So before we go to break, just a quick poll, and then we'll let you stand up and stretch around. So we've been talking about 4 pillars, 4 elements, 4 parts of that onion diagram. And those are the 4 key areas that TCFD recommends you disclose information on related to climate. So just have a quick note here of what are the 4 key areas of the TCFD. And I might with that actually, I'll start our break and leave the poll open, and maybe we can come back to the poll after the break. So if you want to fill out the poll and then take a quick 5-minute break, we have a bunch of comments here, so we'll go through all the comments in the break and make sure that we've addressed all of your questions and comments, and then we'll come back in 5 minutes time. So let's say 18 past, and then we'll continue on from there. Thanks, everyone. Okay, now before we get started, let's go over the results of the poll we launched before the break. So we were asking you, what are the 4 elements of the TCFD? So these are the areas you should be looking at, how you've integrated climate-related risks and opportunities within your organization. So yeah, you really identified them here. They're metrics and targets, risk management, strategy, and governance. And as we mentioned, these are all interlinked. So this doesn't mean you necessarily in your report need to have a section titled metrics and targets, risk management, etc. But these are areas of your report naturally. So it's fitting this information in where it best belongs. Now, we added in there sustainable development and stakeholder engagement. These are rather areas that will improve when you align with TCFD. So those are kind of the unintended consequences of starting to work in this area. So with that, we're going to look at how you can start with this. I know it can seem a little bit daunting, and especially all these new risks and opportunities we haven't thought of having to do that. But then often you're in an organization that maybe you're having to also convince your leadership to move on this. So let's look at kind of a step-by-step process of how to move forward with that. And Davide, I'll come to you with how we can get started on this.
Absolutely, thank you, Tiffany. The main thing, and we have hinted at it already, is for us to suggest analyzing and having a gap analysis as the first step that you want to take to understand what existing processes you already have in place in your organization, to gather data and to report data potentially on other topics, but that can be useful. For example, we have received questions in one of the previous sessions about someone who was working for a business who was certified for the ISO 1401 standards and the 501 standard. And they were asking, can we use the information that we gather regarding energy use and the associated GHG emissions to disclose to TCFD? The answer is yes, you already have this data, you already have processes that are in place, so make the most of them. Then in your reporting, it is important that you have a few points in mind, a few topics in mind that you want to be really clear on. You want to be clear about the content of the report. You want to keep it short, because it will be part of your financial report, so you don't want to make your financial reports too long, if possible. You want to make it as easy to understand as possible. You will not only want to focus on the good news, but you will also want to report on the challenges that you may be facing as an organization and what you're doing to address these challenges. You will want to report as much forward-looking information as possible, and connected to this, you will want to define the time horizons that you are taking into account. If you're talking about short, if you're talking about medium or long term, you will want to attach a time value to this in order to allow readers to understand better what you mean. And the TCFD guidance do not provide a specific time value for these horizons, because the guidance and the recommendations realize that every company is in a different place in its TCFD disclosure journey, different top sectors, different operations. So the time horizons will be different for each company. Moving on, once you have realized and done the gap analysis, you will want to have a roadmap for the disclosure. Now, this is just a potential example of what a roadmap may look. We also suggest having the gap analysis first, at the same time as creating an internal working group. You will want to establish climate governance, develop plans for how to conduct scenario analysis, which we're going to talk about in the next session. And eventually you will get to the point where you've integrated climate-related information in the decision-making of the company. One important element of climate disclosure is creating a TCFD team with the company. That may be called however you prefer. You will probably want to have a climate champion, someone who can really guide, and someone who is as high level as possible to be able to integrate climate-related assessments into the company's whole business model. But we want to highlight the fact that it is not only a work for the sustainability team. The sustainability team has a very strong role to play in this, but this is a whole of company exercise. It will involve risk management, it will involve finance, it will involve the strategy of the company itself, it will involve internal investor relations as well. So the team should be wide enough to capture all these areas of the business. You can, as we said, leverage already what is existing. What climate data, related data are you already capturing? What are you already disclosing? What structures and processes are already in place? As we saw, CDP, GRI, SASB, CDSB, all of these are linked to TCFD. So if you're already reporting to those, you can you can extract the information you're already reporting and integrate it into your financial disclosures in order to be TCFD compliant. Moving on, one example, for example, is to use CDP disclosures and the CDSB building blocks approach together, and you have a link there, which will allow you to understand which of the data that you are disclosing to CDP, which is wider than TCFD, will help you disclose to TCFD itself. This is just one example. There are many other ways in which you can approach this. Going on, we have here a 3-step approach that can help you decide how to move in this reporting space. So focusing on what should we report first, and then how to build upon these disclosures. The first foundations that you want to build upon focus mostly on governance and risk management. You may want to start with some narrative information regarding what is the board doing to identify climate-related risks. Is the board overseeing these issues? Is the board discussing these issues? What is the management's role? And here we go back to this idea of the connection between management and board, and how this should be investigated in your climate disclosures. In this first phase, you will want to also talk about how to manage climate risk. Do you have processes in place for it? Are these integrated into the overall risk management process for the company? In the second phase, moving on to wider and more in-depth disclosures, you will want to enhance, to increase on what you are already disclosing, while continuing to disclose what you already started doing. So you will want to bolt on considerations of how the board, for example, considers climate-related issues in when reviewing capital expenditures, when reviewing acquisitions, divestitures. You will want to start analyzing the different exposure to climate-related issues by sector and by geography for your operations, and how these have specifically affected your business and your strategy. You will also want to start disclosing on metrics and targets. So disclosing some key metrics for a certain amount of years, potentially, if possible, the past 3 or plus years, in order to create and allow to create trends and seeing where the company is going potentially. The suggestion is to start with scope 1 and 2 emissions. Of course, scope 3 emissions are important, so they should be included as soon as possible. You will want to disclose the key performance indicators used to assess the progress against these climate-related targets, and the climate-related targets that you may have set. Further disclosures and a third phase, if you want to adopt this 3-phase approach, builds even more upon this. So from the governance point of view, you will want to move on to how the board considers climate-related issues when reviewing and guiding the company's strategy. So how not only climate is already integrated in the strategy, but how the board uses climate to change the strategy. You will talk about the timeframes that you've associated with material climate-related issues, how climate-related scenarios inform strategy and financial planning, and this connects to the metrics and targets that you're disclosing. Because here in this part, you will want to start working on scenarios. You will start working on more in-depth data and the metrics and targets disclosures. So you will want to connect these issues as much as possible. And also for risk management, you may want to start to also implement how the company is considering existing and emerging regulatory requirements related to climate change, which as we have seen are coming and will be coming more and more in the future. So just for a quick poll, we're asking you what key actions will you take next to progress climate-related disclosure in your organization? Will you want to establish a TCFD team internally, conduct a gap analysis, develop a roadmap, establish internal climate governance, or not sure yet? Ask me next week.
Hey, maybe we take this time to address a question. I was just starting to type, but maybe it's easier to discuss verbally. So someone had asked about GHG emissions. There's been a few questions about GHG emissions, and just to note that the TCFD does recommend the GHG protocol as a framework for calculating your GHG emissions. And there's a lot of really great guidance from the GHG protocol, particularly on that scope 3, where there seems to be quite a bit of concern. So that's the GHG protocol's value chain guidance is very useful for that. But this question is about the base year. Should we keep the base year the same for scope 1 to 3? And I mean, I often give the same answer as Davide. Maybe you have additional insight on this, but my perspective is being as clear as possible for your report users. So obviously having a different base year for the different scopes can be a little bit confusing. If you do that, you need to explain why, what was the reasoning behind choosing to do that. And also making sure that with those emissions, we'll show examples next time too, but you're putting it into perspective of the revenue of the organization or some sort of intensity metric so that you can see, you know, a growth in emissions doesn't necessarily mean a growth in intensity. Maybe your organization grew in that time. So it's important to put it into perspective for investors to see for your own governance as well, how you're progressing. And if you're improving your emissions, reporting it using metrics that help identify that decrease in intensity, maybe not decrease in overall emissions. Davide, do you have anything to add to the GHG emission conversation?
Absolutely. I completely agree with you. Personally, in my past, I've worked for companies assessing emissions, companies working on investors, supporting investors in these issues, and we found that the more consistency there is throughout the disclosure, the better it is, the clearer it is. So using a similar base year is really useful because it allows to create trends, it allows to assess the developments in the company from different angles. Of course, we do understand that sometimes this is not possible because the data is not there. So in that case, we would advise, as Tiffany said, being as clear as possible, disclosing the reason behind the different timeframes, for example. So the more clarity you can provide about your decisions, the better it is for whoever is assessing the reporting, and for yourself eventually, because it will allow whoever is assessing the report to understand the thought process behind it. And even in cases where there are data gaps, there are some assumptions made, being able to understand this is an assumption, this is the reason why, and this is how it's worked, is much better than just having a number that might or might not be accurate.
Wonderful, thanks. So I've shared now the poll results for you.
Thank you. So yes, good to see we have 20%, not sure yet, ask me next week. We'll see, next week will help you. The main idea, the first step is probably to conduct a gap analysis so that you can understand what you already have in place so you don't duplicate efforts. But these steps are, they do come together. They do feed off one they do feed off each other. So establishing a TCFD team, starting to find out who is and should be involved is definitely important. And the roadmap will come nearly organically once you have the information about what you already have.
We also had a question about how long this process should take. I just noted that TCFD recommends between 3 and 5 years for the whole process. So that will really depend on each organization. Also to note that as you do the gap analysis, the TCFD checklist in Annex 1 of the SSE model guidance can be very helpful. Ariana will pop that in the chat again so you can access it, but it's also on the TCFD hub and the SSE's website. And that just goes through all the recommended disclosures and it puts it in a question format so you can put yourself in a report user's shoes and determine, do you have this information available? And if not, how can you get to that point? And that'll help you kind of develop that roadmap and identify what areas of your reporting have the biggest gaps in it. So we're gonna let you all put this into practice now and have a reflection in your own organization of where those gaps might be and what phase you might already be in your own disclosure. So if you all want to just take a moment, I'm just going to check on time. We're a little short on time, so maybe we're just going to take maybe 5 to 7 minutes to go to your corporate website, look at your own reporting, maybe just look at the most recent reports that your organization has put out, and try to determine what phase you're already at. Some of you might already be involved in this process, so you might know quite well what information your company is sharing. And I'm gonna actually leave it on this screen so you can kind of see those 3 phases that Davide was discussing with you. And once you've determined where your company is at, those in phase 1 are usually the first to notify us because they know from the get-go that they haven't really started anything yet. But even if you're at phase 1, do have a think about some of these because you might actually be a little bit more progressed than you think. As Davide mentioned, you can use other reporting mechanisms you've already been using. Maybe your company has GRI, maybe it uses integrated reporting or does the CDP questionnaire. So it might already have quite a bit of this information collected, or it might be already doing these things but not communicating it with its investor community. So just take maybe the next 5 minutes or so to think about your own organization, where you're at. Let us know where you're at in the chat and maybe what struggles you're having to move forward, and we're going to discuss in 5 minutes or so how to move from the one phase to the next phase. Okay, I'll give maybe another minute for anyone who might already be typing their comments to go ahead and enter those comments, and then we'll start discussing them. Okay, Davide, are you okay if we get started? Great. So I'm gonna address a few of these, and then maybe you can jump in on the ones that you've been able to take a look at. So a few that stood out to me, there was there's a couple of people who are at phase 2 or a little bit more advanced in this process, which is really great to see. One question that stood out here was someone was saying that they're already reporting this information in their sustainability report, but they're still wondering how to get that into their financial filings, which is, I think, a very common question. However, not as daunting as it might seem. I might give an example. Someone else said that they've already started to develop a sustainability committee. They've really worked on that governance structure, which is something that already appears in your financial filings. So corporate governance is a normal part of our financial filings. And we'll show you kind of exactly how this can be integrated next time with examples. But doing that kind of gap analysis to what the TCFD recommends can really highlight the information that's related to your financial filings and how that appears. A materiality assessment is often very important because we don't want to include in our financial reports information that's not going to have a financial impact on our organization. So doing a materiality analysis and seeing how this information that you've put in your sustainability report financially impacts your organization is very important. And the TCFD gives you a lot of support on that. So if you use the TCFD recommendations and that guidance document, the 2017 original one, but then the 2021 gives even more. It looks at financial impact from a financial performance perspective and a financial position perspective. So looking at, are these risks and opportunities going to cause an increase in revenue, an increase in costs, all those risks that Davide was discussing and opportunities all come kind of with a financial impact. Also in your financial position, are there changes to the carrying amount of assets that you might have, changes to expected portfolio value, etc. So I think that really helps to drag it into your financial report, is determining the financial impact first. Davide, we've got a lot in there now. Have you spotted any that we need to discuss?
Yes, one specifically from Henry that is quite well linked to what you just said, running a materiality assessment and realizing and working on realizing how material are environmental issues for your organization. Henry says that when they assess their materiality sustainability matters, environmental and climate matters were ranked lower by the key stakeholders in terms of importance to stakeholders and impact on businesses compared to other areas of ESG. So the sustainability report focuses more on social and governance matters instead of emphasizing on environment. What would be our recommendation? Of course, it depends on the business. Some businesses will be more exposed to the physical impacts, and we understand one thing that we would really highlight is that climate-related risks are not only physical risks, they are also transition risks that may go unnoticed in many cases, but are still material, still relevant. Take, for example, just for example, the upcoming, well, let's call it wave of mandatory disclosure around the world. That is a transition risk for a company that has not started moving on this in this field. So it is likely that there will be material risks, even if lower than other companies, for most companies. So running a materiality assessment, taking carefully into account transition risk, liability risks, is important.
Great. Yeah, I also see someone's noting, and a few people have talked about governance now, is kind of getting a committee or integrating this into governance. And someone said practical challenges is to create strong awareness for the entire board. Next move would be an enlightened management to put climate sustainability and risk management agenda. We're at phase 1. What a great starting point. I think that's exactly what needs to happen moving forward. It's good to hear that that's kind of the next steps looking forward. And Ralitza is going to talk a little bit momentarily in resources that the IFC has on corporate governance. They've done a lot of work on corporate governance, and from the investor perspective, I'm sure she can give you a little bit more when she talks about their resources, about how important that is for the board and the management to be educated and to understand these risks and the financial impacts related to them. Maybe we have time for just one more. Davide, was there another one you wanted to address?
To be honest, I think we covered most of them. It's good to see that we have quite a few companies and quite a few attendants who have not started yet, but they are studying it now. So potentially they will be moving towards a phase 1 approach straight away, or at least start creating this gap analysis. Mm-hmm. So there is a suggestion on a need to rely on consultants. Yes, consultants can be important, can be useful. They might not be necessary, but it is a useful. They are useful tools, if we want to call them tools, to help you on this track. And CDP has a list of accredited solution providers that can help you with that. So I will pop it in the chat in a moment, just in case you were looking for something.
And those are particularly helpful at the beginning to make sure you're covering all those blind spots, because often because we're so used to working in a certain way, we miss certain areas, particularly in our scope 3 emissions or our value chain, which we don't see as being kind of huge hotspots in terms of emission or climate impact. So those consultants, just to have a different perspective, and someone who's worked with many companies, can be certainly really helpful. I might move then back to you, Davide, to take us through the resources that are available.
Of course. Now we have divided resources that we suggest into 2 buckets. On the one side, the TCFD specific resources, and on the other, the resources related to your geography, more at large. The TCFD related resources that we would invite you to visit, and that are linked in these slides you will receive at the end of this presentation, are the TCFD implementation guide and the good practice handbook. There are also a number of sector specific guidance documents that can help you. Oh, no. Okay. And then the TCFD knowledge hub, which is it has been linked a couple of times. It is a very, very good repository of resources. There are courses as well that we will discuss more in depth in the next session, but it is something that we suggest you go and visit and familiarize yourself with, because it is really, really useful. In addition, the SSE model guidance on climate disclosure, that again has been mentioned a couple of times over these 2 hours, and that is potentially not the most yeah, let's say the most important tool that you can use, or certainly one of the most useful tools that you can use, because it will guide you through climate disclosure. And colleagues at the SSC have done a fantastic job in supporting TCFD implementation. Moving on, we can pass it on to Ralitza, who is here to talk to us about the IFC work on this field.
Thank you, David and Tiffany. And you heard from my colleagues in the beginning in terms of the work that that IFC is doing both in the region and globally. And as they mentioned, IFC works both as an investor and advisor in emerging markets, and in both roles, disclosure and transparency is critical for us. As an investor, there was a few questions about are investors looking into that information? What information are they looking into? And I can guarantee that as part of our due diligence, based on our performance standards and corporate governance methodologies, and in each for each investee company, we have an investor review meeting where the questions about their material, environmental, and social issues, and now particularly questions about the climate risks and opportunities, are they identified, how the companies are addressing them, are reviewed and included. Also, IFC invests with alongside other investors, like with the Hong Kong Capital Market Authority. We're making a fund, and sustainable finance fund, where they're using our due diligence process. So this is very much reviewed. In order to address this, 5 years ago, we started the program because most of the companies in the regions where we are struggling how to put together to put the puzzle together among different frameworks and requests, how to talk to the board, to the management about these issues. So we developed a set of resources, a toolkit with guidance and a step-by-step approach, how to move from basic to good to best international practices, with very helpful examples and also guidance how to identify materiality among different issues, how to report now during COVID as well. And we work alongside ISSB for development of ESG disclosure guidelines in different regions. We just finished the one in South Africa, where they are developing as well a separate climate disclosure guidelines for the market itself. And as I mentioned in a few of the comments, there are a lot of global developments at the moment, including OECD is looking to revise their corporate governance standards in the region globally. And that is very important when it comes to the awareness to the board. On the IFC side, we have used our corporate governance methodology, and our colleagues in the region, Kate Lazarus and the team, can provide support for any of these types of trainings. But we are developing a particular climate governance disclosure matrix, because having the buy-in from the top, and particularly the dialogue between the management and the board on these issues, is extremely relevant. This comes to the question of the consultants. It is great to have the consultants to provide you the technical support, but what we found very often in the companies that we're working in, one of our recommendations is that they're not the one driving the process for you. You have the communication about all the internal departments to have the systems to collect the information, and then having the unfettered access to the board through sustainability, risk audit, or any other relevant committee for that. So they shared the link about our resources, and then you can contact Kate in the region and then ask globally for any support and further information. Thank you, Tiffany and Davide.
Thank you, Renitza. With regards to the market sector-specific resources, we can point you towards the fantastic work done by Bursa Malaysia, with the Bursa Sustain page, which will help you understand further and contextualize further these issues. The Sustainability Reporting Guide launched by the Bursa themselves. And also the Malaysian Code on Corporate Governance will help you. We have hinted at it earlier today, and it will help you understand what the requirements are for you. Moving on, Tiffany.
Sorry, was muted. Okay, so I'm just going to quickly note that we'll be meeting again next week to dig deeper into these topics we were discussing. I'm going to move past this though, since we're a bit short on time. I'm going to move to the last slide, but if you do have questions, please feel free to note those and we'll answer them as quickly as we can. Just to note, we do ask that you please fill in a feedback survey that you're going to get. It's there in the link or in the chat now. This is how you get your CPD certification for completing this course. It also helps us to understand how we can make sure we tailor next session for all of you. So we very much appreciate any comments or detailed information you'd like to share with us so we can make sure that next session is the most helpful for you. Now I'm going to pause here with just a quick thank you to Bloomberg Philanthropies and IFC for their financial support, and note that you have also contact details there for anyone you might need. And we did have a question in the Q&A that maybe I'll just, do we have time? We have 1 minute. I'll quickly address. I was going to type it, but they're a wholesale seller, and they are saying, is TCFD really relevant to us? It's third parties that are responsible for a number of their kind of emissions. They're saying transportation. And yes, indeed, it's definitely very important for you too. And particularly when you think of this from a risk perspective and an opportunity perspective, it starts that communication with your value chain to make sure that you know where they're going and the shifts they're going to have. If your third party company is a high emitter and they're not moving into maybe the electric vehicle space, it's important for you to understand that and see that risk. So everyone should be using this in what it's most useful for them, of course. I think we're out of time now, and just to respect everybody's time, I'm going to close out now and thank you all for participating with us today and all the really great questions. Thank you, Davide and Relitza and the other ISC colleagues, and to Ariana and Rita for helping coordinate this. Thanks to Bursa Malaysia also.
Thank you very much to everyone. See you next week.
Thank you.